Now that I've got my binding tower built, it's time to put that thing to work. We're going to install some maple binding on the acoustic guitar. Stick around. What's going on? Welcome back to this episode of Homebuilt Workshop where, yes, we are cranking away on the acoustic guitar. Today I need to work on installing the binding. Now that we have our binding tower ready to go, it's time to put that thing to work, cut our purfling and binding channels, and get our maple binding installed. Now, since we're using wooden binding, it's important to bend that ahead of time because there's no way that you can flex that into place once you get the binding channels cut. So before we really get to cutting binding channels, I want to build a jig so that we can bend the binding to exactly match the shape of my instrument. Now, just like when we bent the sides, my friend Matt at Zimbelman Guitars is going to allow me to use his bender to bend these bindings. However, when we bent the sides, we used one of his existing molds, which was close in shape, but there were a couple curves that just weren't quite the same, so I had to struggle with a couple areas to keep everything in shape. So to avoid that this time around, I'm going to build my own mold that is compatible with his bender. That way, everything will match perfectly and hopefully our binding will fit almost exact. In order to make everything match, remember this master template that I used when I made the mold for the body? I'm going to use this as my template as well to make my bending mold. Since the mold for my body is based on this shape right here, if I use this to make my bending mold for sides and bindings, then my shapes should, in theory, match up really well. There's really only one thing that I need to change. Since this is an outer mold and we're making an inner mold, I need to offset this shape to the inside by about 90 thousandths of an inch. That's going to account for the thickness of the sides and hopefully give us a little bit better fit. I'll use some double-sided tape to stick my master template to a piece of MDF. To make sure everything's lined up, I'll just align the flat edge on my work surface and stick it down. Then using a washer that I've ground off one side to be about 90 thousandths of an inch, I'll use that to trace my line around the outside of the template. Dang mechanical pencils, they make me crazy. And now I have an outline that I can cut out on the bandsaw and sand to my line that's going to be about 90 thousandths undersized from my mold. That's going to make up the thickness of my sides. And now I'll use this piece as my master to make enough of these to glue up a 6-inch wide block. It's going to be a lot of work on the router table. I'm not going to go super in-depth as to making these copies. If you want to see exactly the same process, go back and check out the video where I made the mold for this acoustic. It's going to be exactly the same. We're just going to duplicate these on the router table. These are some alignment holes that I'll use a wooden dowel to help keep everything lined up during the glue up. Well, that's a mess. After assembling my giant block of MDF and cleaning up the glue joints, this thing's ready to be put to use. You may notice I drilled a couple holes on the side for using some clamps to hold different cauls in place, mainly this one. I've also added some blocks down here at the ends, which are just really some clamping blocks so I can get in there with some clamps in case I need to clamp something in place. But this thing's ready to be put to use and bend some binding, which I have right here. This is just some standard maple binding. There's just a light flame in there, so I think it's just enough where it'll look really cool once we get it on the guitar body. We're gonna head over to Zimbelman Guitars, use this mold in his side bender to bend this binding. Got all that? Let's do this. The process for bending the binding is pretty much identical to bending the sides. We'll lightly wet the binding with some water, and it'll get wrapped up in some aluminum foil. We're going to create the same sandwich using spring steel, our wrapped up binding, and the heating blanket, and place that into the mold. With the jig loaded up, it's time to plug in the heating blanket and let things warm up. Once it's up to temperature, we can apply some spring pressure, gently bending the binding into place. Once it's cooled off, I'll remove the binding from the jig and I'll re-clamp it to my mold to keep its shape while I head back to the shop. Well, after bending the binding, that's a little bit of a tongue twister. I've got it back here at the shop. I've let this sit overnight so that it's good and dry. I kept it clamped up so that we can hopefully retain as much of the shape as possible. I think we're now ready to take this out of here and get ready to start working on the body. It looks like we've got a little bit of spring back. Hopefully, once we get into it, that won't be excessive. The good part is that this binding is really thin and fairly flexible anyway, so we shouldn't have too many issues trying to get this in place. Also, you'll probably notice that I bent more pieces than I'm going to need. In a perfect world, I only need 4 pieces of binding, but, well, one of these had some bad tear out, so that one's likely to break, and you just never know what might happen along the way. So, at least for this first time around, I want to have plenty of extra. I think now is a perfect time to start sanding on the body. It's important to sand the sides before routing the binding channel because the binding cutter references off of the sides, so any irregularities that may be in the sides are going to translate to the binding channel, so we need to make sure it's nice and smooth now. Well, you may notice that I'm using a little bit of a different setup here to sand. At first I thought I could just hold this by hand while sanding it, but it only took a couple of minutes to realize that I need some sort of a vise or something to hold the body. So I came up with this super quick, very inexpensive Moxon style vise. Now this was nothing fancy, a couple pieces of 2x4, and I just utilized a couple pipe clamps that I already have. It's working for now. I've lined the jaws with some leather to give a little bit of cushion and help hold the body. I think later on we're going to build a little bit more finished style of Moxon vise, but for now this simple 2x4 pipe clamp version seems to be working just fine. After all the sanding, I'm going to take a minute and vacuum off all of the sanding dust. Padauk has a high chance of staining the light wood of the spruce top, and I want to get all of that off of there so that I can apply a wash coat of shellac to kind of seal in the grain and help prevent tear out. So now, I believe I'm ready to set up the binding tower to cut these binding channels. If you haven't seen this build yet, there's a link in the video description. This is my version of the binding tower. This is the prototype version 1, I guess we'll call it. I'm going to be testing it out as is and making some changes and modifications before releasing a final version. I plan to include a set of drawings and stuff like that where you can make your own version of this. But again, this is a prototype, and as I test it out, I'll figure out what I need to change and modify and before we release those drawings. So keep an eye out for that. Sturdy. I've got my binding cutter in the router, and I've taken a piece of the binding, held it up here. We've got just a little overhang, enough room for the purfling. We're going to test this out, make sure it's going to fit. Might need to go to the next size larger bearing now that I look at it. Let's test it first though. I made at least a dozen test cuts, trying out different combinations of bearings and depths. I want to make sure that I get these channels to fit both the purfling and the binding as perfect as I can. I think that's going to work. Now I'll drop the body into the cradle and I'll adjust the movable brackets so that the top is the same height at both ends of the body. Well, after giving myself quite the headache, I think I have the bearing combination and the bit setup that I'm going to need to make these cuts. Now this process is really pretty simple and there's no way it should have given me the headache that I have right now. The challenge I was having was getting the right combination of bearing sizes for the thickness of the wooden binding, but added to that is the fact that I'm making my own purfling. This is not an off-the-shelf size, so I had to experiment with the different bearing sizes, figure out how thick I need to make these, and then find out that I got one of the dimensions wrong and I had to take this down just a little bit more. Again, not really a hard process, but just the combination of getting the correct bearings and making the correct purfling. Yeah, that was a little challenging. But we got this worked out. Everything looks really good. I think we're ready to put router to body. Here we go. Hang in there, bud. You're gonna be okay. We're doing the purfling channel first. As I'm making these cuts, you'll see me lift the router and move the body to a different location. That's because I'm always trying to keep my cut going downhill or with the grain. If you cut against the grain, you have a much higher chance of getting tear out, and we really don't want that. Once I get all the downhill portions cut, then I'll make a pass going the opposite direction and finish cutting the channel all the way around. The purfling's just proud of the top, which is perfect. Nice. Now I'm ready to route the channel for the binding. I've swapped out the bit on my bearing for the appropriate size, and I've quadruple checked my depth on a scrap piece. We're ready to cut. I'm going to cut the channel on the top first. This is going to create a stepped channel. Then I'll flip the body over in the sled, double check my measurements again, and we'll cut the channel on the back. They're going to have the same binding on the top and the back. It's just that the top is going to have some purfling. Well, that was slightly scary like all the other cutting steps on this project, but I am super happy with the fit. We're just a tiny bit proud of the back, a little proud of the sides. This is going to work well. The channel around the spruce top had just a few fuzzies in there that I removed using a light touch with a file. Now I'll begin fitting the binding into place. I'm just using binding tape to hold everything together. Trying to be very careful and make sure that it's tight to the body with no gaps. I used a razor saw to trim the binding to length. I broke my piece of purfling. I don't think that's going to be a big deal. Since it's so small, I should be able to just glue that back together when we put it in place. I think it's going to be fine. And I'll repeat that exact same process for the back. A tiny sanding block helps me fine-tune the fit where the two pieces of binding come together. Well, there it is. I think we're ready for glue. Finally, between you and me, this was probably the most fiddly part of this whole process. Not entirely difficult, but just trying to keep everything in alignment, make sure there's no gaps, all of that. Yeah, this was a little finicky. Oh, my headache's gone. I've decided this time around I'm going to use some thin CA glue and we'll just wick it into the binding all the way around. Really, I wanted to use wood glue, but at this moment I just don't feel comfortable with my abilities to be able to apply the glue, get the binding in place, and get everything taped up before that glue sets up and have no gaps, or at least minimal gaps. For now, I'm going to wick in some water-thin super glue and we'll get this binding glued down. The super glue that I am using is made by Starbond. You've seen me use this many times before. It is my preferred super glue of choice. There's a link in the video description if you want to check some out for yourself and save 10% on your order. There's one side. I'm going to give this a few minutes to dry. I really want to try to avoid accelerator if I can because I don't want to risk it foaming and really kind of bubbling up like it sometimes does. Now, if there were a couple areas where maybe you had a gap, I did have a little block here with some leather on there that I was going to use to push in there, but as I go around, everything looks okay, so we're going to let it dry, do the same thing to the back side. On the back, I did have one area where I did need to use my padded block to close a gap while I squirted some accelerator on there, but really, for the most part, this went really smooth. Once our glue's dry, I've removed all the tape. Don't worry, I spared you all the tediousness of pulling all of that tape off of there. And then I went back around with the CA glue and filled in any areas that didn't quite wick in due to the tape being in place. Now everything's sealed all the way around. As I'm inspecting it, I think it looks pretty good. It looks a little wonky right now because, well, the binding's not flush. We're gonna make that flush now. I started by removing the high spots on the top and back using a card scraper. Then I switched over to my rolling pin sander for the sides. Now I'm not sanding the sides with this sander, I'm using this more so to level the high spots on the binding. Once I have the bulk of the material removed, then I'm just going to use a wide assortment of different sanding blocks to sand the binding nice and flush. I'm also being mindful as I sand to try to keep everything nice and flat and straight. I think I'm going to stop here for the sanding. I've sanded it up to 320, and I know for a fact we're going to have to do more sanding as we move on later to pour filling and finish sanding and all that. So I don't want to sand it too much right now. I think I'm pretty happy with the way this binding looks. Most of the seams look really good. I don't really see any gaps or anything like that. Everything pulled in nice and tight. There are a couple spots where the binding got a little bit thin. For some reason I had to remove more material than I anticipated. Even though I did the setup and everything seemed just fine, everything fit really good, just a teensy bit proud on the sides as well as the top. I really don't have a good explanation as to why that ended up like that, but it did, and for now, I'm just gonna have to deal with it and move on. And by moving on, that means setting this completed body aside and we get to start working on the neck. That'll be in the next episode of the acoustic guitar build. Thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you next time.